Welcome to Wars and Dusk. Tonight, we journey to the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, where a single Soviet encirclement order transformed a city of rubble into the grave of an entire German army. If history's greatest conflicts are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the past carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your body settle into whatever surface holds you tonight. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift, slowly, the way fog lifts from a river in the early morning hours, not all at once, but gradually, layer by layer, until the water beneath is still and clear. Tonight, we are going to travel back in time. Not quickly. Not urgently. We are going to drift, gently, toward one of the most consequential moments in the history of the modern world. A city. A river. A winter that no army was truly prepared for. The story we are entering tonight unfolded over many months, across many miles of frozen steppe and ruined streets. But at its heart, it turns on a single, extraordinary night, a night when one side of a war made a decision so large, so sweeping, so perfectly timed that the entire shape of the conflict began to change. We will arrive at that night together. But to understand it fully, to feel the weight of it the way the soldiers and commanders who lived through it felt the weight, we need to walk the road that led there. So breathe slowly. There is nowhere to be. Nothing to solve. Tonight, you are simply a listener, drifting through history at the pace of snowfall on the Russian steppe. Let the world outside grow quiet. And let us begin. Part 1: A city called Steel. Before it became a battlefield, Stalingrad was a symbol. Not just in the political sense, though that dimension was always present and always significant. The city bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, Joseph Stalin, and that name alone gave the place a weight that went beyond geography, beyond industry, beyond military strategy. To hold Stalingrad was, in the minds of those who governed the Soviet Union, to hold something almost sacred. To lose it was unthinkable, not merely as a tactical defeat, but as a kind of public humiliation that struck at the very identity of the Soviet state. But Stalingrad was also genuinely important for reasons that had nothing to do with names or symbols. It was a long, sprawling city, some 45 kilometers from its northern edge to its southern suburbs, pressed against the western bank of the Volga River like a hand laid flat against a table. The Volga, at this point in its journey southward toward the Caspian Sea, was broad and powerful. In summer it moved with the kind of quiet authority that only very large rivers possess. In winter, it froze in places, and crossing it became both more dangerous and more vital, a lifeline across the ice. The city's industries had grown rapidly during the 1930s, when the Soviet state was engaged in its massive program of industrialization. Factories lined the riverbank for miles. The tractor factory, which had been converted to produce tanks, was perhaps the most famous, but there were others: the Barricades Artillery Factory, the Red October Steel Plant. These were not small workshops. They were vast, grim, functional complexes, built for output rather than beauty, staffed by thousands of workers who had come from across the Soviet Union looking for wages and purpose in the new industrial order. And then there was the river itself, the Volga. As a logistical artery, its importance to the Soviet war effort could hardly be overstated. Oil from the Caucasus fields, food from the southern agricultural regions, men and material from the eastern industrial heartland, all of it moved along the Volga or depended on routes that ran through or near the city. If Germany could sever that artery, the consequences for Soviet capacity to wage war would be severe. If Germany could place artillery on the river's western bank in sufficient strength, even river traffic that did not pass through the city itself would be threatened. So the city mattered on multiple levels simultaneously. It was a name, a symbol, an industrial center, and a geographic key all at once. And it was toward this city that the German military machine turned its attention in the summer of 1942, after the extraordinary but ultimately inconclusive bloodletting of 1941. To understand why Germany chose to strike south and east in 1942, toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus, rather than renewing the push toward Moscow that had so nearly succeeded the previous year, we need to appreciate the condition in which the German war machine found itself as winter gave way to spring. Operation Barbarossa, launched on the 22nd of June, 1941, had been the largest military invasion in the history of human warfare. 3 million German soldiers, along with hundreds of thousands of Allied troops from Romania, Hungary, Finland, and Italy, had crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching more than 3,000 kilometers. In the first weeks and months, the results had been staggering. Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed in operations of a scale and speed that military historians still find difficult to fully comprehend. At Kiev, at Minsk, at Smolensk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers had been taken prisoner, often in a matter of days. And yet the Soviet Union had not collapsed. That was the central, defining surprise of 1941, not the victories themselves, which were real and remarkable, but the fact that those victories did not end the war. The Soviet state absorbed losses that would have destroyed most nations and continued fighting. New armies were raised. New factories, relocated to the Ural Mountains and beyond, began producing tanks and artillery and aircraft. The road to Moscow had been reached by Army Group Center by December 1941, but the city had not fallen, and a Soviet counteroffensive had pushed the exhausted Germans back from the capital's approaches. By the spring of 1942, Germany faced a war of attrition it had not planned for and did not want. Its forces were spread across an enormous front. Its losses had been severe, in men, in machines, in horses, in the accumulated energy of the blitzkrieg style of warfare that depended on momentum and surprise. The original plan had called for the Soviet Union to fall within perhaps 6 to 8 weeks. It was now approaching a year, and the war showed no sign of ending. Hitler's response to this situation, to the gap between what had been expected and what had occurred, was characteristically bold, and characteristically blind to certain realities that his generals were beginning to understand with increasing clarity. He decided to strike for the oil. The Caucasus oil fields, centered around Baku, on the Caspian Sea, produced a significant portion of Soviet fuel. If Germany could seize them, Soviet mechanized warfare would be strangled. And if Germany could secure them for itself, the chronic fuel shortages that were already beginning to constrain German operations would be relieved. The plan, codified as Case Blue, Fall Blau in German, called for a massive offensive by Army Group South, sweeping eastward and then southward toward the Caucasus, with a parallel thrust toward Stalingrad to protect the northern flank of the operation. It was an ambitious plan. Some would say an overambitious one. The distances involved were vast. The logistical demands were enormous. And the assumption underlying the entire operation, that the Soviet Union had been sufficiently weakened by 1941 that it could not mount effective resistance, was, as events would reveal, not quite accurate. But in the summer of 1942, as the German offensive rolled eastward and the Soviet front bent and buckled under the pressure, none of that was yet apparent. The distances seemed manageable. The victories seemed real. And the city on the Volga seemed, to the generals and the dictator who commanded them, within reach. What no one in those summer headquarters could clearly see, what no map could show, what no reconnaissance photograph could reveal, was the decision that was quietly being made on the other side of the front. The patient, careful, catastrophically consequential decision that would turn everything around. Part 2. The World Germany Sent East. To understand the battle for Stalingrad, truly to understand it, in the way that goes beneath the arrows on strategy maps and reaches the human beings who fought it, we need to spend a little time with the men who marched east in the summer of 1942. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was the formation that would ultimately bear primary responsibility for the attack on Stalingrad itself. It was, by many measures, one of the finest armies Germany possessed. Its soldiers were experienced, many of them veterans of the campaigns in France and Poland, and of the first year of fighting in the Soviet Union. Its officer corps was professional and capable. Its equipment, while never in sufficient supply, was generally of high quality. And it had, in the preceding months, performed well in the operations that had carried it to the approaches of Stalingrad. General Paulus himself was a complex figure. He was tall, meticulous, with the demeanor of a staff officer rather than a frontline commander, precise in his habits, careful in his planning, deeply loyal to the chain of command above him. He was not, by temperament, a man who challenged his superiors or trusted his own instincts over explicit orders. This quality, which might in other circumstances have been simply professional discipline, would become one of the defining factors in the tragedy that followed. The men under his command came from across Germany, from Bavaria and Prussia, from Rhineland cities and Württemberg villages. They were farmers' sons and factory workers' sons, teachers and mechanics and students who had been drawn into the vast machinery of the Wehrmacht. They were, in the summer of 1942, generally confident, if tired. The victories of the preceding year had given them a belief in the German military's ability to prevail. And the summer's advances had reinforced that belief. The Soviet armies they had faced had retreated, often in disorder. The steppe had unrolled before them in the golden heat of June and July like something out of a soldier's dream of conquest. But the steppe was deceptive. The distances were difficult to appreciate from inside a truck or a tank. On a map, the line from the Don River to the Volga looked manageable, perhaps 70 or 80 kilometers at the point where the thrust would cross. But each of those kilometers in summer heat, along roads that were often little more than packed earth tracks, with supply lines stretching back hundreds of kilometers to railheads that were themselves hundreds of kilometers from major German logistics bases, each of those kilometers was a kind of debt that accumulated quietly, invisibly, in the army's capacity to sustain itself. And there was another element that maps did not show: the Sixth Army's flanks. As the German advance drove deeper into Soviet territory, as the Sixth Army pushed toward Stalingrad from the west and the north, the flanks of that advance, stretching out on either side of the axis of attack, were held not primarily by German formations but by Allied armies. To the north of the Sixth Army's position, along the Great Curve of the Don River, the line was held primarily by the Romanian Third Army. To the south, on the other side of Stalingrad's urban perimeter, was the Romanian Fourth Army, and further south still, elements of Italian and Hungarian formations. These were not, for the most part, well-equipped, well-armed, or well-supplied forces. Romania, Hungary, and Italy had contributed their armies to Germany's campaign as a matter of political alliance, but they lacked the anti-tank weaponry, the logistical infrastructure, and in many cases the training to hold a front line against serious Soviet pressure. The German liaison officers attached to these formations understood their weaknesses. Some of the German generals, men like General von Wakes, who commanded Army Group B, and General Zeitzler, who would become Army Chief of Staff in September 1942, raised concerns about the vulnerability of these flank positions. They were concerns that, at the time, were not sufficiently acted upon. As August 1942 gave way to September, and the first German units reached the outskirts of Stalingrad and began the brutal business of fighting their way into the city, the flanks of the great salient that was forming around Stalingrad grew longer, and thinner, and more exposed with each passing day. Inside the city, the fighting took on a character unlike anything most of the German soldiers had experienced before. Urban combat in Stalingrad was close, grinding, intimate, and merciless. The city's apartment blocks, factories, and warehouses, many of them already damaged or destroyed by German air and artillery bombardment, became fortresses, each one contested room by room, floor by floor, sometimes level by level within the same building. German soldiers gave names to the places they fought: the grain elevator, the Commissar's house, the Pavlov's house, a four-story apartment building held for months by a small Soviet garrison under Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, now one of the enduring symbols of the defense. The tactics the Soviets employed, keeping their forward positions as close to the German lines as possible, so that German air power and artillery could not be used without risk of hitting their own men, were born of necessity but proved brilliantly effective. General Vasily Chukov, who commanded the Soviet 62nd Army holding the city itself, called it hugging the enemy, staying so close that the advantages of German firepower were neutralized. Chukov was a remarkable commander. Rough, direct, fearless in a way that sometimes shaded toward recklessness, he had a quality that his soldiers recognized and responded to: he did not leave. While the fighting raged, while the Volga crossing behind him was regularly struck by German fire, while supply and reinforcement trickled in under fire every night, Chukov remained on the western bank with his men. His headquarters moved more than once under the pressure of German advances, but he never crossed back to the relative safety of the eastern bank. He understood, intuitively, that his presence was as important as any tactical decision he might make. The soldiers of both sides lived in the rubble. They lived in basements, in the burned-out hulks of machinery, in shell craters. They went days without proper food. Water was precious and irregular. Sleep was snatched in minutes, in whatever shelter could be found between one firefight and the next. The German soldiers who had marched east in the summer believing this campaign would be over before winter began to understand, as October deepened and the cold came creeping in from the steppe, that something had gone wrong with the timeline they had been given. And on the other side of the river, on the eastern bank, where Soviet command and logistics were concentrated, a different kind of thinking was beginning to take shape. A plan. Quiet, careful, systematic, and vast. Part 3. The Architects of Reversal. Every great turning point in military history has its architects, the men and women whose thinking shaped the decision that changed everything. The reversal at Stalingrad was no exception. And the architects of that reversal were, in many ways, as interesting as the battle itself. The two most important figures in the planning of what would become Operation Uranus, the Soviet offensive that would encircle the German Sixth Army, were Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky. They were, in temperament and background, quite different men, but they shared a quality that made them dangerous opponents. They were capable of thinking at operational scale, of seeing the entire theater of the war rather than just the immediate battle in front of them. Georgy Zhukov is perhaps the most famous Soviet military figure of the Second World War, and with good reason. He had demonstrated, as early as 1939, at the Battle of Khakan-Gol on the Mongolian border, a capacity for bold, combined arms offensive operations that was unusual in any army of that era. He had been instrumental in the defense of Moscow in the winter of 1941, when the Soviet counteroffensive had driven the Germans back from the capital's outskirts and provided the first clear evidence that the Wehrmacht could be stopped and reversed. He was direct, sometimes brutal in his methods, not given to sentimentality or excessive caution. Alexander Vasilevsky was different in manner, more measured, more diplomatic, with a staff officer's gift for coordination and the kind of meticulous attention to logistics and planning that large operations required. Where Zhukov sometimes operated on instinct sharpened by experience, Vasilevsky was the architect who drew the blueprint in precise, careful lines. Together, they formed a complementary partnership that would prove extraordinarily effective. Behind both of them, providing ultimate sanction and exercising the kind of centralized control that the Soviet system both demanded and permitted, was Stalin himself. Stalin's relationship with his military commanders in 1942 was complicated by the catastrophes of 1941, some of which had been made worse by his own interference. He had, in the early months of the war, trusted too much in his own strategic instincts and too little in his generals. He had issued orders to hold positions that needed to be abandoned, with catastrophic results. But by 1942, there had been a subtle shift, not a complete one, not a transformation of Stalin into a thoughtful delegator, but a recognition that the men who had his confidence needed room to develop and execute large plans. That recognition was critical to what happened next. Zhukov had been in Moscow in mid-September 1942, reporting to Stalin on the situation at Stalingrad. The conversation that followed has become one of the most discussed in Soviet military historiography, because it appears to be the moment when the conceptual kernel of Operation Uranus was first articulated at the highest level. Zhukov and Vasilevsky, speaking quietly between themselves in an anteroom while Stalin studied a map, apparently agreed that something beyond reinforcing the city's defenders was needed. That a purely defensive response to the German offensive was not enough. That the situation demanded something larger. What they were thinking about, what they began, in the days and weeks that followed, to develop into a concrete plan, was not simply a counterattack. It was an encirclement. The concept of encirclement, of cutting off and destroying an enemy force rather than simply pushing it back, was deeply embedded in military thinking on both sides of the Eastern Front. The Germans had practiced it brilliantly in 1941, destroying multiple Soviet armies in the Great Encirclement battles of the first year. But what Zhukov and Vasilevsky were now contemplating was an encirclement on a scale that would turn the method against its most accomplished practitioners. The key to the plan lay in the very weakness that German planners had noted but not adequately addressed: the exposed flanks of the salient around Stalingrad, held by the Romanian armies. The idea, in its essential form, was elegant in the way that good military plans often are. Two powerful armored thrusts, one from the north and one from the south, would strike the Romanian flanks simultaneously. Moving rapidly, exploiting the mobility that the open steppe permitted, these armored forces would drive deep, bypassing pockets of resistance, maintaining momentum. The two thrusts would meet somewhere to the west of Stalingrad, cutting off the German Sixth Army, and whatever other forces were caught inside the encirclement, from supply, reinforcement, and retreat. The beauty of the plan was inseparable from its audacity. It asked for a very great deal: sufficient forces concentrated at the breakthrough points without those concentrations being detected by German intelligence, a level of coordination between forces operating on different axes, separated by hundreds of kilometers, a speed of advance that would prevent the Germans from organizing effective countermeasures before the encirclement was complete, and the operational discipline to keep the armored forces moving even when their flanks were threatened and their supply lines were extended. All of these requirements were demanding. Some of them were, given the state of Soviet military organization and equipment in 1942, very demanding indeed. The Red Army of 1942 was not the Army of 1944, better equipped, better led, and deeply experienced in combined arms operations. It was still an army rebuilding from catastrophic losses, still developing the doctrinal understanding and practical skill to execute large offensive operations reliably. But Zhukov and Vasilevsky, and the staff officers who worked with them through the autumn weeks, believed it could be done. And Stalin, reviewing the plan, agreed. The preparation that followed was one of the most impressive feats of operational security and logistical organization in the entire war. 3 army groups, what the Soviets called fronts, were quietly reinforced. The Southwest Front, the Don Front, and the Stalingrad Front together would provide the manpower and the armor for the operation. New tank armies were built up. Artillery was concentrated, enormous quantities of it, moved carefully and quietly into position. Ammunition was stockpiled. Supply dumps were established. And all of this was done with extraordinary care for secrecy. Movements were conducted at night. Radio silence was enforced. Officers were briefed only on their own portion of the plan, not the whole. The principle of what modern military planners call need to know was applied strictly. The result was that German intelligence, which was, in other respects, capable and resourceful, failed to detect the full scale of what was being prepared against them. German aerial reconnaissance did observe some evidence of Soviet buildup. There were reports of troop movements, of supply concentrations. But the interpretation placed on these observations was consistently wrong. German intelligence assumed, partly because of the precedents of 1941, when Soviet armies had consistently fallen short of what was needed to decisively defeat German forces, and partly because of a kind of institutional arrogance that had developed through a year of tactical success, that any Soviet offensive would be limited in scope and manageable in impact. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption was. Part 4, November's Edge. By November of 1942, the city of Stalingrad had been fighting for more than 2 months. It is worth pausing here, truly pausing, to consider what 2 months of continuous urban combat meant for the human beings caught inside it. In the rubble of what had once been apartment blocks, factory workshops, and civic buildings, Soviet soldiers held their positions with a tenacity that often defied any straightforward military explanation. They held because they were ordered to hold. They held because withdrawal meant crossing the Volga under fire, and the crossing was itself dangerous and uncertain. They held because the commanders around them held, and in war, example carries a weight that orders sometimes cannot. But they also held because something had shifted in the understanding of what this particular place meant. Stalingrad was not simply a city anymore. It had become, for the Soviet soldiers who fought there, a kind of argument, a counter-argument to the narrative of inevitable German victory that had seemed so plausible through the summer and autumn of 1941. Every building held, every floor contested, every day the Sixth Army's advance was slowed by a handful of determined defenders in a basement or on a rooftop was a small refutation of the idea that Germany could not be stopped. The German soldiers, for their part, were experiencing a different and more disorienting emotional journey. They had come to Stalingrad expecting, or at least hoping, that the city would fall quickly, as so many Soviet positions had fallen quickly in the preceding months. Instead, they had been drawn into a kind of combat for which their training and doctrine had not truly prepared them. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war of tanks, motorized infantry, and close air support moving rapidly across open terrain, had very little application in a city reduced to rubble. There, the advantage shifted to the defender, who knew the terrain, who had prepared positions, who could move through tunnels and sewers and the interconnected basements of devastated buildings in ways that attackers could not easily follow or anticipate. German soldiers began to speak of Rattenkrieg, rat war. The war of the rats, of creatures scurrying through ruins, of combat so close that the normal distances of military engagement, where artillery and air power could be employed, collapsed to the width of a corridor or the depth of a room. Casualties on both sides had been severe. Soviet losses in the city were enormous. Chukhov's 62nd Army was regularly reinforced across the Volga precisely because the rate of attrition was so high that without constant replacement the army would simply cease to exist. But German losses had also been significant, and each German casualty was a soldier who was harder to replace than his Soviet counterpart, because Germany's reserves, unlike the Soviet Union's, were not inexhaustible, and the front stretched in both directions for thousands of kilometers, all of it making demands on the same limited pool of men. By November, the German Sixth Army's position in Stalingrad was, on the map, impressive. It had captured roughly 90% of the city's built-up area. The 62nd Army was compressed into a narrow strip of the western Volga bank, in places only a few hundred meters deep. It seemed, to an observer looking at the territorial situation, that the city must fall soon. But appearance and reality were diverging in ways that the map did not show. The Sixth Army was exhausted. Its divisions, which had begun this summer with full establishment, were now significantly under strength. Its supply situation was difficult. The long logistical lines from Germany stretched across a landscape in which roads were scarce, railways were single-tracked and easily disrupted, and the demands of the entire southern front competed for limited transport. The ammunition, fuel, and food that reached the Sixth Army were rarely adequate to what the army needed. More significantly, fatally significantly, as events would prove, the flanks remained held by the Romanian armies, and those flanks were long. November on the Russian steppe brought something that was both utterly predictable. Every soldier on the Eastern Front had known for a year that winter would come, and also, in its severity and its effect on the military situation, somehow not fully anticipated. The temperature dropped. The steppe froze. The ground, which in summer and autumn had been either dust or mud depending on the rainfall, hardened to iron under the frost. The Don River, along which the Romanian Third Army held its positions to the north, began to freeze. And somewhere, many miles back, in the rear areas that German reconnaissance could not fully observe, in the forests and river valleys where Soviet forces had been concentrating for weeks, the plan was ready. The date chosen for the offensive was the 19th of November, 1942. The season had been chosen deliberately. Soviet planners understood that winter favored them, their soldiers were better equipped for cold weather, their supply lines were more robust against snow and ice, and the frozen steppe would actually facilitate the movement of armor, which could cross frozen rivers and travel across hardened ground that had been impassable in autumn. The date was chosen with equal care, late enough that the German defensive position would be most extended and least mobile, early enough that the winter would work for rather than against the attacking forces. Everything was in position. The question was whether it would work. Part 5, The Night the Gun Spoke. Before first light on the 19th of November, 1942, the Soviet Southwest Front and Don Front prepared to announce themselves to the world. In the pre-dawn darkness, along a front that stretched for hundreds of kilometers north and northwest of Stalingrad, more than 3,500 artillery pieces and mortars had been positioned. Their crews stood in the freezing cold, temperatures had fallen well below zero, checking the alignments, confirming the fire plans, waiting for the signal. Many of them had been in position for days, maintaining silence, keeping fires minimal to avoid detection, enduring the cold in ways that required a particular kind of disciplined suffering. The artillery preparation that opened Operation Uranus at approximately 0730 on the morning of the 19th has been described by those who witnessed it in terms that reach for metaphor almost involuntarily. It was not merely loud, though it was, of course, impossibly loud, the sound of several thousand guns firing simultaneously carrying across the frozen steppe in waves that observers many miles away felt as much as heard, a vibration in the chest, in the bones, in the earth itself. It was the sound of something fundamental changing. The barrage fell on the Romanian Third Army's positions with devastating effect. The Romanian soldiers in their defensive lines had been under growing pressure for weeks, and their positions, never as deep or as fortified as German positions would have been, were inadequate to absorb what was now falling on them. The artillery did not merely destroy weapons and positions, it destroyed the organizational coherence of the units, severing communications between commanders and their troops, creating gaps that the following assault could exploit. For 80 minutes, the barrage continued. Then, in the freezing fog that lay over the steppe that morning, limiting visibility to perhaps a few hundred meters in places, the Soviet armored columns began to move. The tanks that led the Soviet armored thrust on the 19th of November were not individually remarkable vehicles. The T-34, which was the backbone of Soviet armored strength, was a capable tank, well armored, reasonably fast, with a good gun for the period, but not dramatically superior to the German tanks and anti-tank weapons it would face. What made the Soviet armored thrust remarkable was not the quality of individual vehicles but the quantity, the coordination, and above all the operational concept. The armored columns were not expected to fight for every defended position they encountered. They were expected to move, to keep moving, to bypass resistance where they could, to follow the paths of least opposition, to maintain the kind of momentum that would carry them deep into the German rear before the German command could organize an effective response. This was, in a very real sense, the blitzkrieg principle turned against its inventors. The Romanian lines, in most sectors, broke quickly. The anti-tank weapons available to the Romanian infantry were inadequate in both number and caliber to stop Soviet tanks. The artillery support that might have compensated for this weakness had been disrupted by the Soviet preparatory barrage. And the sheer scale of the breakthrough, the fact that Soviet armor was advancing on multiple axes simultaneously, made it impossible for local commanders to concentrate their limited reserves effectively. In some Romanian units, resistance was fierce, and there are accounts of individual Romanian officers and soldiers fighting with real courage against overwhelming force. The collapse of the Romanian Third Army was not a matter of cowardice. It was a matter of military resources being simply insufficient for what was being asked of them. They had been placed in a position that the most professional and well-equipped army in the world would have found difficult to hold against the weight that was now falling on them. By midday on the 19th, the breakthrough on the northern flank was clearly established. Soviet armored formations had penetrated the Romanian lines in multiple places, and the gaps were widening as the day progressed. The question now was whether the southern thrust, which was scheduled to begin on the following day, the 20th of November, would achieve the same results, and whether the two arms of the encirclement could link up before the German command could react effectively. Inside the 6th Army's headquarters, which was located at Golubenka, near the Don River, General Paulus received the news of the Soviet breakthrough with what his staff described as controlled alarm. He was not initially, a man who panicked. But the reports arriving from the Romanian Third Army's sector were alarming in their consistency and in the picture they painted of a very large Soviet offensive rather than a localized counterattack. Paulus requested permission from Army Group B to release the armored reserves, specifically the 48th Panzer Corps, which was positioned behind the northern flank, to counterattack the Soviet breakthrough. The request involved a delay, as all such requests did in the German command structure, because decisions of this magnitude required consultation up the chain of command, ultimately to Hitler himself, who retained direct personal authority over significant armored movements. The delay, measured in hours, was costly. When the 48th Panzer Corps finally began to move, it found itself operating in conditions that were far from ideal. The fog that had obscured the morning's attack was still present in places. Communications were disrupted. The Romanian units through whose sectors the German tanks had to move were disorganized and in some cases blocking the very roads the panzers needed to use. And the Soviet armored columns, rather than waiting to be counterattacked, were continuing to advance, making it difficult to identify where to strike and creating a situation of controlled chaos that confused German coordination. The counterattack by the 48th Panzer Corps achieved some local successes. It was, after all, a German armored formation, and German armored forces in 1942 retained a real tactical excellence. But it could not seal the breach. The breakthrough was too wide, too deep, and supported by too many Soviet follow-on forces. By the evening of the 19th of November, the northern arm of the Soviet encirclement was driving southward and southeastward, and no force available to Army Group B could stop it. One arm of the trap had closed. The other was about to. Part 6: The Southern Strike. On the morning of the 20th of November, 1942, approximately 24 hours after the northern offensive had begun, the southern arm of Operation Uranus announced itself. The Stalingrad front, commanded by General Andrei Yeremenko, opened its attack against the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad in conditions that were, if anything, more challenging than those the northern attackers had faced the previous day. The fog was dense. The temperature had dropped further overnight. Along the southern flank, the terrain was more complex. The flat steppe was broken in places by gullies and frozen stream beds, by the remnants of small villages, by obstacles that could delay the movement of armor and give defending forces opportunities to organize resistance. But the result, in its essentials, replicated what had occurred on the northern flank. The Soviet artillery preparation fell on the Romanian positions with similar weight and with similar effect. The Romanian Fourth Army, like its northern counterpart, lacked the means to absorb what was being delivered against it. The communications that would have allowed higher command to direct reserves into threatened sectors were disrupted or destroyed. And when the Soviet armor moved forward through the fog, it found gaps in the Romanian defensive line that opened, in the crucial first hours, faster than they could be closed. The Soviet forces attacking from the south had a somewhat shorter distance to cover to reach the planned link-up point than the northern forces, but they faced the additional challenge of German armored reserves positioned in the area, specifically elements of the 4th Panzer Army, which was trying to hold the southern portion of the front. The interaction between advancing Soviet armor and German panzer forces in the area south of Stalingrad on the 20th of November produced confused, mobile battles across a wide area of steppe. In those battles, the German forces demonstrated, as they would continue to demonstrate throughout this campaign, a remarkable capacity for tactical improvisation. Small German armored units, often a handful of tanks and some motorized infantry, organized themselves into Kampfgruppen, battle groups, and mounted counterattacks with a speed and aggression that frequently surprised Soviet commanders and inflicted losses out of proportion to their numbers. The individual quality of German armor tactics in this period was high. But individual tactical quality could not substitute for strategic position, and the strategic position of the German forces south of Stalingrad was deteriorating rapidly. The Soviet armored forces were not looking to fight pitched battles with German tank units. They were trying to get around them, to maintain momentum, to reach the link-up point before German reserves could seal the breach. And they were succeeding. By the evening of the 20th, the southern breakthrough was well established, and the Soviet armored spearheads were driving northwestward with increasing speed. The distance between the northern and southern arms of the encirclement, which had been perhaps 150 kilometers when the offensive began, was shrinking with each hour. Inside Stalingrad itself, the effect of these events on the soldiers of the 62nd Army was difficult to describe precisely, because information traveled slowly and imperfectly in the midst of combat. But Zhukov and his commanders knew something significant was happening. The German pressure on the city, which had been relentless for months, began, almost imperceptibly, to lighten. Not dramatically, not immediately, but in the subtle, almost intuitive way that experienced soldiers come to read the quality of the fighting around them, there was a sense that something had shifted. On the German side, the implications were becoming impossible to ignore, but they were also, for many officers, genuinely difficult to believe. The speed of the Soviet advance, the scale of the breakthrough, the size of the force involved, exceeded what German intelligence had predicted was possible. The category error was profound. German planners had been evaluating Soviet capability based on the evidence of 1941 and early 1942, when Soviet offensive operations had consistently fallen short of what was needed to achieve decisive results. They had not adequately credited the changes that had occurred in Soviet command, Soviet doctrine, and Soviet equipment since those early disasters. That miscalculation was now being paid for in the most concrete possible currency. General Paulus, from his headquarters, was sending increasingly urgent messages to Army Group B, to OKH, the German Army High Command, and ultimately to Hitler himself, describing the developing situation and requesting guidance. The messages paint a picture of a senior commander who understood the danger clearly but who was, by training and temperament, unwilling to act against the explicit orders and preferences of his superiors. He would wait to be told what to do. He would not act on his own authority. It was a quality that, in the circumstances then unfolding, would have catastrophic consequences. Part 7, The Closing of the Ring. On the 22nd of November, 1942, at the town of Kalach on the Don, the two Soviet armored spearheads found each other. The link-up at Kalach has a quality, in the way it unfolded, in the small details that historians have preserved, that belongs in the same company as the great set pieces of military history. The Soviet 4th Tank Corps, advancing from the north, and the 4th Mechanized Corps, advancing from the south, made contact in the pre-dawn hours of the 22nd, at a bridge over the Don River that had been seized in a night operation by a small Soviet advance party. The seizure of the Kalach Bridge deserves a moment's attention, because it illustrates something important about the quality of Soviet operational planning for this offensive. A small Soviet armored group, a handful of tanks, approached the bridge in the darkness on the night of the 21st, moving through the confusion of the German rear area where no one had yet quite absorbed the fact that Soviet armor was operating many miles behind the front line. Moving with their lights on, an audacious measure, calculated to suggest that they were German vehicles, the Soviet tanks drove through German positions without being challenged until they were close to the bridge itself. The German guards at the bridge were surprised and overcome before they could destroy it. The bridge across the Don, intact, fell into Soviet hands. It was across that bridge, and around that town, that the two arms of the encirclement closed on the 22nd. The German 6th Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army that had been caught within the closing ring, was now surrounded. The encircled force was enormous. Estimates vary in their precision, but the number of German and Allied soldiers trapped within what became known as the Kessel, the Cauldron, was approximately 300,000 men. 300,000 soldiers, in a pocket that was roughly 50 kilometers wide and perhaps 40 kilometers deep, without a front line that connected to the rest of the German army, without a guaranteed supply line, in temperatures that were dropping toward -20 or 30 degrees Celsius, in a landscape that offered almost no natural shelter. The scale of the encirclement was something the German military had never experienced in this war. It had created encirclements, large ones, devastating ones, but it had not been on the receiving end of one. The psychological and institutional shock of finding oneself in this position, of being the encircled rather than the encircler, was considerable, and it affected decision-making at every level of the German command from Paulus's headquarters to Hitler's situation conferences in Germany. For the Soviet commanders, the link-up at Kalik was a moment of extraordinary satisfaction, but not, importantly, a moment of celebration that blinded them to the work that remained. Encircling an army of 300,000 and destroying it were two very different things. The German Sixth Army was still a formidable fighting force, still capable of organized resistance. It had its heavy weapons, its artillery, its experienced officers and soldiers. And if Germany could establish an air supply route to the pocket, as Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe commander, was claiming could be done, and if a relief force could be organized to break through to the encircled army from outside, the encirclement might yet be broken. These were not trivial possibilities. They were the scenarios that the Soviet command now had to plan against even as it consolidated the ring and began to squeeze it tighter. Inside the pocket, the debate that would define the next 2 months, and that would, in the end, seal the fate of the Sixth Army, was beginning. Should the Sixth Army attempt to break out to the west immediately, before the Soviet encirclement was fully consolidated and before the army's supply situation became critical? Or should it remain in place, trusting to the Luftwaffe's promised airlift and the relief force that Army Group Dawn, newly created under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was supposedly preparing? Paulus, characteristically, sought explicit direction from Hitler before acting. Hitler's direction, when it came, was unambiguous: hold the pocket. Do not attempt a breakout. Stay, and trust to the airlift and the coming relief. It was, with hindsight, a decision that condemned the Sixth Army. But hindsight is a gift that history distributes only retrospectively, and in the hours and days immediately following the encirclement, the question was genuinely uncertain enough that reasonable arguments could be made on both sides. Some of Paulus's senior officers, most notably General Friedrich von Paulus's chief of staff, General Schmidt, and several of his corps commanders, urged a breakout immediately, arguing that the window of opportunity would close quickly and that the airlift promises were unlikely to be fulfilled. Others urged patience, arguing that the army's artillery and heavy equipment, which could not be moved quickly enough to accompany a breakout, were essential assets that should not be abandoned. What settled the matter, ultimately, was Hitler's order, and Paulus's obedience to it. The ring had closed. And within the ring, 300,000 men began to wait, for relief, for supply, for a decision that would never arrive in time. Part 8: The Airlift and its Reckoning. Promises made in the abstract are tested by reality in the most unforgiving of classrooms. Hermann Göring had assured Hitler, with the confidence of a man who understood aviation in the political rather than the operational sense, that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army by air. He put the figure required at something in the range of 500 to 600 tons per day, which was the estimate that Paulus's logistics officers calculated would be necessary to sustain the army at a minimum level of operational capability, that is, capable of fighting, capable of feeding its men, capable of keeping its equipment operational in the extreme cold. 500 tons per day. The operational reality of supplying a besieged force of 300,000 men by air, over a distance of many hundreds of kilometers, in the conditions that prevailed over the Russian steppe in winter 1942, produced numbers that were very different from what Göring had promised. The Luftwaffe, at the height of its effort, managed to deliver approximately 100 tons per day on the best days. On many days, the delivery was far less, sometimes as low as 70 or 80 tons, sometimes less still when weather grounded the transport aircraft or when Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft artillery took their toll on the supply flights. The average over the period of the airlift was somewhere between 100 and 150 tons per day, roughly a quarter of what was needed. The consequences for the men inside the pocket were felt almost immediately, and they became progressively more severe as the weeks passed. Food rations were cut, first to 2/3 of normal, then to half, then further. Horses. The army depended on horses for artillery movement and other purposes, and it had many thousands of them inside the pocket, began to be slaughtered for food, which provided temporary relief but accelerated the army's loss of mobility. Ammunition was rationed, limiting the army's ability to conduct offensive or even vigorous defensive operations. Fuel became critically short, which had the effect of limiting the movement of armor and motor transport to absolutely essential purposes. And the cold. November had been bitter, December was savage. Temperatures dropped to -20, -30, occasionally -40 degrees Celsius. Men in positions in the open steppe, in positions that offered almost no shelter from the wind that came off the steppe with nothing to break it, suffered frostbite in numbers that quickly overwhelmed the army's medical resources. The casualties from cold alone were significant. The fuel shortage meant that vehicle engines had to be run periodically to prevent them from freezing solid, a demand on fuel that competed directly with operational needs. Equipment maintenance became almost impossible, weapons jammed, mechanisms froze, and the mechanical ingenuity of German soldiers in improvising solutions to these problems, solutions that were often imaginative and sometimes effective, could not entirely compensate for the conditions. The psychological condition of the men inside the pocket is documented in letters that were written and sent out via the airlift in the weeks before the situation became too desperate for correspondence, and that have been preserved and studied by historians as a uniquely intimate record of soldiers' experience. The early letters reflect shock at the encirclement, but also a degree of confidence, a belief that the relief would come, that this was a temporary situation, that the army would not be abandoned. Later letters are darker, more questioning, and in some cases openly despairing, as the days stretched into weeks and the relief that had been promised did not materialize. Outside the pocket, meanwhile, the promised relief was taking shape, but in a form that fell far short of what the situation demanded. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was perhaps the most brilliant operational commander Germany produced in the entire war. He had the kind of mind that could see a battlefield in 3 dimensions, that could identify possibilities others missed and exploit them with speed and decisiveness. He had been given command of Army Group Dawn, a new formation assembled from whatever units could be scraped together, and tasked with breaking through to the 6th Army. The operation, codenamed Winter Storm, Wintergewitter, began on the 12th of December, 1942. A panzer force built around 3 armored divisions struck northward from the area around Kotelnikovo, south of the encirclement. In the first days, the progress was encouraging. The leading elements advanced with speed, crossing the Oksay River and then the Mishkova River as Soviet forces attempted to organize resistance against the unexpected thrust. At the furthest point of the relief forces' advance, on the 22nd of December, 10 days after the operation began, the leading German tanks were approximately 45 kilometers from the southern edge of the 6th Army's pocket. 45 kilometers. In summer, in open terrain, with fuel and confidence, that might have been a morning's drive. But it was winter. The Soviet response had been rapid and powerful. New forces were being committed to block the relief corridor. And on the 19th of December, a new Soviet offensive, Operation Little Saturn, had struck the Italian 8th Army to the northwest, threatening to collapse the entire right wing of the German Southern Theater and potentially isolate Army Group Don itself. Manstein faced an impossible calculation. To break through to the 6th Army, he needed more strength than he had. To provide that strength, he would have to strip forces from a position that was itself becoming threatened. And even if his relief force reached the pocket, it faced the additional challenge, which Manstein had argued about with great urgency, of whether the 6th Army would break out to meet it. Manstein's view was that the 6th Army must break out. He sent messages to Paulus urging aggressive movement toward the relief force, arguing that this was the only way to save the army. The code word was thunderclap, Donnerschlag, and its use was to signal the 6th Army to begin moving. The order never came from Hitler. Paulus, without an explicit order to break out, without permission to abandon the pocket and the heavy equipment that a breakout would require leaving behind, did not move. Manstein's relief force, unable to advance further against growing Soviet resistance and with its own flanks threatened by the new Soviet offensive to the northwest, was forced to halt and then to withdraw. The last real opportunity to save the 6th Army had passed. Part 9. The Long Dying. January 1943 inside the Stalingrad pocket was a month that defies easy description. Not because what happened was mysterious or complex in its mechanics, it was not, but because the human experience of what occurred stretches the capacity of ordinary language to convey. Let us try, quietly and carefully, to understand it. By the beginning of January, the 6th Army had been encircled for approximately 6 weeks. The airlift had delivered, consistently, far less than what was needed. The food supply was, in clinical terms, well below what was required to sustain human beings under the conditions, physical labor, combat, cold, that the soldiers were experiencing. The average daily caloric intake of a soldier in the pocket in January 1943 was, depending on his unit's position and supply situation, somewhere between 300 and 800 calories, in conditions where the body needed perhaps 4,000 or more to maintain itself in extreme cold. The effects of sustained malnutrition, combined with cold exposure, were appearing throughout the army. Men who had been robust, who had marched hundreds of kilometers and fought through the summer and autumn, were becoming physically diminished. Their ability to perform demanding tasks, to dig positions in frozen ground, to carry equipment, to maintain alertness on watch, was declining. Their resistance to cold injury was declining. And the psychological effects, the depression, the difficulty of maintaining purpose and organization in conditions of progressive physical deterioration, were adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. And yet, and this is one of the most remarkable facts of the entire Stalingrad story, the army held together as an organized military force for longer than might reasonably have been expected. The explanation is partly institutional. The Wehrmacht had developed, over years, an organizational culture of unit cohesion and discipline that was genuinely robust, and that persisted under pressure in ways that are documented throughout this campaign. It is partly individual, the accounts of officers and NCOs who drove themselves and their men to maintain standards, to keep weapons clean, to establish routines in the chaos, are numerous and consistent. And it is partly, perhaps, the particular numbness that extreme physical deprivation sometimes produces, a state in which the organism simply continues because it has not yet found the moment to stop. The Soviet command understood that the Sixth Army, however weakened, was not going to simply dissolve on its own. The encirclement ring had to be tightened. The pocket had to be compressed. And ultimately, the army had to be defeated in the field. Operation Ring, Operacja Koltso, was the Soviet plan for the final destruction of the encircled force. It was to be commanded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky, whose Don front would coordinate the assault from multiple directions, compressing the pocket first from the west, then closing in from all sides. Before the assault began, the Soviets made a formal offer of surrender to the German forces in the pocket. On the 8th of January, 1943, a formal ultimatum was delivered to the German command, a document that offered honorable terms, the lives of the soldiers who surrendered, medical treatment for the wounded, the right of officers to retain their personal weapons, and the eventual return of prisoners to their home countries after the war. Paulus transmitted the ultimatum to Hitler. Hitler's response was predictable: the offer was to be rejected. The Sixth Army would fight to the end. To do otherwise would be treachery. The ultimatum expired on the 9th of January. On the 10th, Operation Ring began. The Soviet assault was executed with a weight of fire and a coordination that reflected both the strength the Red Army had accumulated around the pocket and the experience it had gained in the preceding months. Artillery preparation was massive, 5,000 guns and mortars firing on positions that the cold, the malnutrition, and the ammunition shortage had reduced to a fraction of their former strength. The German lines held, in some sectors, longer than Soviet planners had anticipated. Individual units, knowing that surrender had been refused and that there was nowhere to retreat, fought with a tenacity born of desperation. But the weight was overwhelming, and it was being applied systematically, and each day the pocket shrank. The pocket was divided into a northern and a southern section in the last days of January. Paulus, promoted by Hitler to Field Marshal on the 30th of January, the day before his surrender, was in the southern pocket, in a department store in the ruins of Stalingrad, surrounded by the remnants of his headquarters staff. He surrendered on the 31st of January, 1943. The northern pocket, under General Karl Strecker, held for 2 more days, surrendering on the 2nd of February. When the fighting ended, approximately 90,000 German soldiers passed into Soviet captivity, the survivors of an army that had numbered 300,000 when the encirclement began. The difference represents dead, killed in battle, killed by cold, killed by starvation, killed by disease and despair in the weeks between the closing of the ring and the army's final collapse. Of the 90,000 who surrendered, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. Most died in Soviet captivity, of the same combination of cold, malnutrition, and disease that had been killing them inside the pocket, conditions that reflected both the vast scale of Soviet prisoner handling and the enormous strains under which the Soviet state itself was operating. It was one of the greatest military disasters in German history. Part 10: What Stalingrad Meant. When the guns fell silent at Stalingrad in the first days of February 1943, the war was far from over. Germany would continue to fight, in the Soviet Union, in North Africa, in Italy, eventually in France and on its own soil, for more than 2 years after the last survivors of the Sixth Army laid down their weapons. But something had fundamentally and irreversibly changed. Let us think carefully about what that change was, and why it mattered as much as historians have consistently judged it to matter. The most immediate and obvious change was strategic. Germany's ability to determine the operational shape of the war on the Eastern Front, to choose where and when to attack, to force the Soviet command to respond to German initiatives rather than prosecuting its own, had been severely damaged. Before Stalingrad, while Germany had suffered setbacks, the general trajectory of the Eastern Front war had still been shaped largely by German planning. After Stalingrad, the initiative shifted. Not immediately to full Soviet dominance, there would be further German offensive operations, most notably the Great Tank Battle at Kursk in July 1943, which itself would end in German defeat, but the trajectory had changed. Germany was no longer driving the strategic calendar. The material losses were also significant and difficult to replace. 300,000 soldiers, with their weapons, their vehicles, their artillery, their accumulated experience, the loss of this force created gaps in German order of battle that could not be easily filled. Germany was not, even now, at the absolute limit of its manpower, but the reserves were finite, and the demand on them from multiple theaters was growing rather than shrinking. The symbolic and psychological dimensions of the defeat were, in some ways, even more significant than the material ones. Within Germany, the defeat at Stalingrad shattered a narrative. The German public had been told, through the careful management of news and information that characterized the Goebbels propaganda apparatus, that the war was going well, that Germany was winning, that the sacrifices being demanded of German families were investments in a victory that was coming. Stalingrad could not be explained away, could not be reframed as a tactical retreat or a planned withdrawal. The loss of an entire field army, an event unprecedented in German military history, was announced on German radio with a solemnity and a weight that told the listening public something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The 3 days of national mourning that followed the announcement of the Sixth Army's surrender were themselves a kind of acknowledgement, made not by the regime, which was incapable of such admissions, but by the weight of the occasion itself, that the war was not what Germans had been told it was. Within the German military, the effect was complex. Many officers had understood for months that the strategic direction of the war was problematic. Stalingrad crystallized those concerns and gave them a specific, undeniable example to point to. The argument that had been developing quietly among senior German commanders, that the disconnect between Hitler's operational demands and actual military capacity was becoming dangerous, gained force and urgency in the aftermath of Stalingrad. This did not translate into action. The German officer corps, for all its professional excellence, did not produce an effective challenge to Hitler's authority from within the military structure. The attempts that were made, including the assassination attempt of July 1944, failed. But the intellectual and moral fracturing within the officer corps that Stalingrad accelerated had consequences for how the war was fought and, eventually, for how the German state handled its defeat. Within the Soviet Union, the effect of Stalingrad was profound in a quite different way. The victory was real, unambiguous, enormous, impossible to minimize. After the catastrophes of 1941, after the retreats and encirclements and losses that had seemed, at times, to put the survival of the Soviet state in genuine question, here was proof that the Red Army could not only hold but could destroy a major German force in a brilliant and precisely executed operation. That proof mattered enormously, for morale, for the willingness of Soviet soldiers and civilians to continue the immense sacrifices the war was demanding, and for the confidence of the military command in its own capacity to conceive and execute large offensive operations. Zhukov and Vasilevsky, the architects of Uranus, drew from Stalingrad the confidence to plan on an even larger scale. The operations that followed, Kursk, the liberation of Ukraine, Operation Bagration in 1944, reflected a Soviet command that had learned, at Stalingrad, that it could think big and execute successfully. Beyond the Soviet Union and Germany, the meaning of Stalingrad echoed through the wider world. Stalingrad, arriving almost simultaneously with El Alamein and the North Africa landings, created, for the first time in the war, the sense among Allied observers that Germany might actually lose. That was not a certainty, it was still far from certain, and there were many who counseled caution about premature optimism, but it was a possibility that began, after Stalingrad, to feel more real than it had before. Winston Churchill, speaking in the British Parliament, acknowledged Stalingrad in terms that he did not always find easy to apply to Soviet operations. Franklin Roosevelt sent a message to Stalin. Around the world, in the occupied countries of Europe, in the resistance movements and the exile governments and the underground newspapers and the whispered conversations of people living under German occupation, Stalingrad was received as evidence, real, solid, documented evidence, that the tide could turn. That feeling, that turning of the tide, is perhaps the deepest meaning of what happened at Stalingrad. It is, of course, important to be careful about how we tell this story, and about the framing we apply to it. Military history, and especially the history of this war, can be told in ways that make events seem inevitable in retrospect, as if the outcome was always destined, as if the strategic logic pointed in only one direction from the beginning. But that is not how history was experienced by the people who lived through it. For the soldiers in the pocket, shivering in the ruins of a city they had not been able to take, starving and cold and cut off from any realistic hope of relief, there was nothing inevitable about anything. For the Soviet soldiers crossing the Volga under fire in the darkness, reinforcing a position that seemed always on the edge of collapse, there was nothing inevitable about the defense. The outcome that we now know, the encirclement, the destruction of the Sixth Army, the turning of the war, was the product of choices, of planning, of courage, of intelligence, of luck, and of the kinds of human stubbornness and human brilliance that can, on rare occasions, translate into results that change the course of events. It was also, we must never forget, the product of suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. The soldiers of the Sixth Army who died in the pocket, of cold, of hunger, of wounds, of disease, were, most of them, ordinary young men who had not chosen the ideology of the regime they served and who had not started the war they fought in. The soldiers of the Red Army who died in the streets and basements of Stalingrad, who were cut down crossing the Volga, who froze in forward positions during the winter, they too were ordinary men and women caught in forces far larger than themselves. The civilians of Stalingrad who remained in the ruins of their city throughout the battle, hiding in cellars, caught between the two armies, living in conditions that defied ordinary description, they too are part of the story. Military history told honestly must hold all of these people in its account. The commanders and their decisions. The maps and the strategy. And also the humans who lived and died within those decisions, on those maps, according to those strategies. Stalingrad holds all of them. The city itself was eventually rebuilt. It has been renamed. It is now called Volgograd, a name that reflects the river rather than the dictator. On the Mamayev Kurgan, the great hill overlooking the city, the site of some of the most intense fighting of the entire battle, there stands a massive monument, a figure of a woman raising a sword to the sky. It is called the Motherland Calls, Radina Matzovet, and it was, for a time, the tallest statue in the world. Whether you find that monument moving or imposing or simply very large, it stands as a physical acknowledgement that what happened here mattered, that the people who died here deserve to be remembered, that the city that was destroyed and rebuilt has a claim on history's attention. The claim is well-founded. On the night of the 18th of November, 1942, the last night before the guns began, 300,000 German soldiers slept in their positions around a city they had almost conquered. 1 million Soviet soldiers were massed on the frozen steppe, waiting in darkness and silence. The commanders who had planned what was about to happen slept, or lay awake, or stood at their maps and trusted that the plan would hold. By the following evening, the world had changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone caught inside those events could fully perceive as it happened. But changed in a way that, looking back across the decades, we can trace with precision and with a kind of awe at the contingency of it all, at how differently it might have gone, at how many individual choices at every level shaped the outcome, at how much was at stake in a city on a river in the Russian winter. Closing meditation. We have come a long way tonight. From the summer steppe, golden and vast, through the grinding rubble of a city contested room by room. Through the quiet planning rooms where two Soviet generals bent over maps and saw the shape of a possibility that might change everything. Through the freezing darkness of the 19th of November, when the artillery spoke, and the tanks moved, and the ring began to close. Through the long weeks of the pocket, and the airlift that could not sustain a hope it had been asked to carry. Through the final compression, and the surrender, and the silence that followed. Let all of that settle now, like snow on the steppe. Quietly. Without urgency. The men and women who lived this story are, almost all of them, gone now. What remains is the record they left, in letters, in diaries, in the testimony of survivors, in the work of historians who have spent decades trying to understand what happened and why. We owe them the effort of understanding. We owe them the attention that comes from listening carefully, from not turning away from the difficulty of what occurred. And we owe ourselves the peace that comes from having engaged with something true, something real, and then set it gently down. Let your breath slow now. Let the steppe grow quiet in your mind. Let the Volga flow, wide and dark, under the winter sky. Let the history rest. You have been a good listener tonight. Sleep well. If you're still awake, the battles are over now. Rest easy. Subscribe to Wars and Dusk for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.